Alexander, question and a comment. The comment is, whenever I hear people talk about demographic trends and how there's declining bodies of labor for militaries, it seems to me that it's dodging the obvious answer in the room, which is not quite 50% of the people in the room, but 50% of the populations in most of these countries. Which is, rather than worrying about declining numbers of men, it might be the case that we might think about how, maybe it's technology is an easier thing to think about than how to actually get 50% of the population, that is women, more readily integrated in the military. So that's not really an answer to your or a challenge to you. It's just a challenge to the room. That whenever you hear the word demographic trend, think about the social trend that is offsetting that, which is increased desire to have women in the military, and just how do we make that so? Right. The question I have for you is, and this is inspired by a defense fellow that's hanging out at NIPSIA this year, which is you talk about AI solving our, not solving, but addressing our intel problem, of our ISR problem. But just as having human beings do ISR and bringing their biases to the table, the question then is, how do we program our AI so that way whatever humans program them don't have biases that are built into the machinery? Just because a machine's doing it doesn't mean that it doesn't have its own algorithms that cause it to highlight certain things and de-emphasize others. So it might just mean you make worse decisions faster, right, because machines are more efficient rather than actually just getting a clearer picture. Thank you.
I'm one of those who believe that you cannot divorce the strategic value of a deployed formation from its tactical utility, that the two of them are you know, they're one and the same. When I look at the placemat, look at the number of nationalities in any of the battle groups, and you highlighted some of the problems there, I say, if you were going to constitute an effective military unit, you would definitely do not do it like that. Mm-hmm. Probably not. Now, if that's the case, then I would suggest that, you know, the deterrent value of these formations might be actually very, very minimal. And if what you're saying, what you said earlier is true, and that the Russians are very unlikely to come across in a conventional sense, because they are effectively deterred, is it really these things that are doing the deterring? I would suggest it's actually probably the stuff that comes behind them. The NATO response force, you know, the collective military power of NATO, the collective economic power, maybe even nuclear weapons. That is the deterrent. And if that is the case, what exactly is the value of these things other than a political project? Are they deterring? Or is it not a question of deterrence at all? It's a question of assurance of allies. I just think, you know, we need to get our, if that's the case, we need to get our terminology correct. Could you comment on that?
This is for John, I think. Your visits to the EFPs, I'd like you to address, if you could, I don't think it's anywhere else in the program, the psychology of deterrence. So as the force generators of the men and women that actually deploy overseas in these positions, the posture that they adopt when they're in these positions is so important, because we know General Ben Hodges, when he was Commander USAR, had the ready-to-fight-tonight mentality with armored personnel carriers bombed up with full ammunition. Canada took a different approach to that, and we as senior leaders, I think, and Steve Cadden generated, what do you tell your soldiers? How do your soldiers think if you are a tripwire? Are you a deterrent? And I'd be interested what the different nationalities talked about if you did receive that sort of feedback from them.
What I'm going to do is I think we'll go in reverse order of the presentations, and I'll give you each a few minutes to respond to those three questions. Thanks.
So I go first?
Yep.
Yeah, so to Steve first. Thank you very much. So certainly we can offset this, the demographic trends with the social trends, but the worry is more for the next generation. There is a concern that the available manpower will just simply be non-existent in some of these countries, especially Latvia, whether you incorporate women into the military or not. I'm not familiar with the gender dynamics of those militaries, unfortunately. I should be. But I suspect that that the problem is not so much now, because in fact they're expanding their militaries and they seem to be doing much better than I thought they would even a year ago. But the problem is 20, 30 years hence. And if Russia is playing the long game, then this could be serious. As to your question about preparing or programming in a way that will be free of bias, that's a hard one. I don't have any quick answers to give you, except that recognizing the problem is extraordinarily important for precisely the reasons that you mentioned. It's not helpful to make worse decisions faster, as you put it. By recognizing the problem, as some organizations have already, been able to minimize the impact of those sorts of biases.
Thank you for those questions. First, David, in response to yours, yeah, there's this, I think, ongoing debate NATO is wrestling with, and I kind of highlighted some of the aspects of that over whether there's strategic deterrence value in these things. Is that the most important part of it, or is it operational effectiveness? About over a year ago, in the spring of 2017, I was in an Allied capital talking about these units, and at that time they were just beginning to come together. And I was at the Ministry of Defense in this capital, and they were explaining to me how many contributing countries were going to be involved in this one particular EFP unit. And I said, how can you expect that thing to fight? And they were very blunt, these MOD officials. They were action officers. They weren't, political appointees. But they said, we know, that's not important. What we're after is the strategic deterrent value that comes with, and the reassurance that comes with multiple countries being involved in this effort. Again, spreading risk. Now, you made a good point that it's the stuff behind these units that really matters, at least to the Russians. That's what we think, right? Yeah, because they're 1,000 soldiers, right? How much combat power do you really have there? Admittedly, there are 1,000 Western soldiers, so there's a lot of combat power, but it's limited, right? But the stuff behind it doesn't show up in great enough numbers, arguably, or in great enough multinationality unless there's a multinational tripwire along the border. And so I agree with you that it's the follow-on, it's the punishment that comes with deterrence by punishment, but this tripwire, I think, and its multinationality is at once a major, major strength, but as I mentioned, could also be perceived as a weakness. Is it about assurance versus deterrence? Both. I think that if it were about assurance, maybe it's even failing there because, frankly, the Baltic states and Poland, I mean, they're happy to get anything, right? They're just glad to have Allied boots on the ground. But none of them are satisfied. They're all clamoring, for those that don't have Americans in their units, they're all clamoring for Americans to be sent as part of these contingents. And for those that do have the Americans, like the Poles, there was just a story out 2 weeks ago that the Poles are ready to pony up some billions of dollars to host a brigade of American forces. So in terms of assurance, again, it's probably necessary, but maybe insufficient. In terms of deterrence, again, I think it's necessary at the strategic level, but maybe insufficient for some of the operations they're most likely to counter. Sir, for your question about the psychology of deterrence, that's a really good one. When I talk to these units and the commanders and some of the troops, some of them push back really hard on the concept of being a tripwire. These units, commanders, for obvious reasons, don't want to be thought of as cannon fodder, right? And in my interviews, I'm very careful not to, I don't want to offend them. But I think it varies depending on what level of the food chain you're talking about. So at the battalion battle group command level, the commanders, they're all about combat capability. They're about, I am going to be a fighting, capable, operationally important unit. I have serious doubts about that. The problem is, I don't think I'm a genius in this regard. I think these doubts are self-evident to not just the troops and the commanders of the units, but the adversary. And if NATO continues to try to sell these things as combat-ready, capable, operationally deployable units, wow, we're going to create a real gap in terms of our deterrent effect and our reassurance effect. So I worry about that, about what we tell the troops, what we tell the allies. I don't think we've figured this out yet. I don't know if we have a good answer for that yet.
I don't think we do.
If I can chime on to the question that was asked by David Perry about, David Rudd, wrong David. That was last week. About the EFP deployments, I think that the political function is just as important as the capabilities generated. I think one of the perceived weakness of NATO as it enlarged to 29 member states was its ability to demonstrate this alliance cohesion and this common definition of threats. And indeed, you had throughout the 2000s various definitions of what constituted the priority threat. Was it on the eastern flank or was it on the southern flank? And Russia kind of solved that problem for NATO with the annexation of Crimea. And there are there are still debates about how to allocate resources for various priorities within NATO. However, this presented an opportunity for NATO to demonstrate that political willingness. And so if we think back to our deterrence equation about willingness and capabilities, I think it serves a benefit there. And I can't help but to pick up on the point with regards to gender dynamics in the armed forces that Steve made, because I do have the data since I've been working with NATO on both gender mainstreaming and gender balance within the alliance. So Latvia, where the Canadians are, would be at 18% women. So they are amongst the top tier of NATO countries when it comes to women's representation in the armed forces. And you are definitely seeing it turn. In some NATO allies and partner countries, so I'm thinking specifically Norway and Sweden, of reintroducing conscription, but universal conscription of both men and women. And I think there's two reasons for why this is happening. The first is Russia and the need to have more people in the armed forces. And the second one is just social values. And this is an expedient way to get to their targets.
Thank you. My name is Christine Brusgaard. I'm a nuclear security fellow at CSAC, Stanford University. I have a question for John. I really enjoyed, well, all of your presentations. They were very engaging. And I was very intrigued by the caveats that you mentioned, John, and I wanted to hear more of your impressions on how you think the Russians perceive of this potential mess that you describe in terms of fighting power and in terms of caveats. Do you think that this is something that can be perceived as an exploitable weakness and even as a temptation to try and undermine NATO cohesion and credibility?
Brian Cox, I'm a retired U.S. Army legal advisor and also a current Queen's Law student, a master's student. I have primarily a question, I think, for you, Professor Deni, to kind of carry on with the conversation that we were having before and kind of take it to maybe a different direction. I've always kind of assessed that since we announced how we were going to go about the EFP program, that it has less to do about deterrence or assurance and more about kind of a Cold War continuation of maintaining partners in a sphere of influence, so that if NATO is there, that we can maintain the eastern flank and the sphere of influence for the West and for NATO. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on whether that kind of comes into play, even though it's not something I think that makes kind of the strategic messaging. But if there is something that is involved with that, maybe if you think that it's worth like we're getting a good return on the investment, if that's the case.
No, in which case I will take Chair's prerogative to ask Alex a question, because I guess it does actually touch on all the panels, because one of the key themes here is interoperability. And one of the things, you start off your presentation by saying, is this going to be an elite phenomenon, or is this actually going to cheapen things? And one of the things that I look at is with the United States, it's third offset strategy, and I keep looking and thinking, geez, how's Canada going to keep up? But Canada's at least a little better off than Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, etc. So I guess what in your view, what are the implications of new technologies for interoperability, particularly within the context of the NATO alliance? Easy question.
Yeah.
All right, why don't I start? Kristen, thank you for your question. For operational security reasons, I'm not going to go into details on the caveats and who has them and what they are, but this is no surprise to the adversary, to anybody in this room, I'm sure, especially those of you who observed. Anybody that watched Afghanistan unfold and ISAF over more than a dozen years, the Allies have different approaches to what they are what they allow their on-the-ground commanders to do operationally. I'm sure the Russians realize that that problem has not gone away for the alliance. I'm sure they realize it exists to some degree in and among these EFP battle groups. And would I expect the Russians to exploit that? Without a doubt. I think that is at the heart of one of the challenges, that these units face. Again, this is the trade-off that we face. Do we want to spread risk among 18, 19 of 29 allies and ensure that that counterpunch is even more powerful and more likely? Or do we want operationally effective battle groups that can roll out and really, no kidding around, take on a Russian brigade coming across the border? I think for now the alliance has opted for the former. Again, the problem is we've got this disjoint in our rhetoric and how we're selling this, and we're talking about being able to do everything. And I think that's problematic, but I would expect the Russians to exploit it in any case. Brian, on your question about whether this is a continuation of, whether this is really about deterrence and assurance vis-a-vis Russia or a continuation of a Cold War effort to maintain influence, a sphere of influence, frankly, I think this is pretty easily answerable, and that's by employing kind of a counterfactual analysis. Would we see NATO battle groups in the Baltic states and Poland today if Russia had not invaded Ukraine? I can tell you from Washington's perspective, the answer is a clear and unambiguous no. Anybody that knows anything about American forward presence in Europe since the end of the Cold War knows that it was doing a nosedive, right? We went from 250,000 soldiers, just soldiers, Army soldiers in Europe, down to about 28,000 just a couple of years ago. That number has now stabilized and is rising slightly. Just over 30,000 U.S. Army soldiers in Europe now. And of course, NATO has now deployed troops in east of the inter-German border for the first time. None of that would have happened without the Russian invasion. So it is very clear to me that this is all about deterrence and assurance. And in fact, if it weren't, we would not see Americans now wrestling with whether we should put more stuff into Poland permanently, whether we should contribute small contingents to these EFP units, etc. And none of that would be happening.
Stéfanie, that was a terrific question. So my hunch is that issues of interoperability are only going to worsen with AI. That the Europeans will go in their own direction. The Americans, will do their own thing too, and so there'll be also stovepiping within various sectors too. So there'll be multiple tiers of this kind of disconnection. There are some ways to mitigate these risks. There could be obviously cooperation on both sides of the Atlantic with respect to AI. These sorts of technologies are not necessarily zero-sum. But in today's political climate, I find that hard to believe that such collaboration is going to be forthcoming anytime soon.
And Stéfanie?
No, I just want to add that I think that NATO and NATO's top countries have a high tolerance for caveats. I think that alliance cohesion is a goal above all else, and they're willing to tolerate a lot of caveats and a lot of headaches in coordinating those caveats and operations in order to demonstrate that alliance solidarity and that cohesion within the alliance. So I think that tolerance is high in general. Yeah.
Thomas Hughes again from Queen's University. Two questions. First for Stéfanie, because I'm not entirely sure she's had enough of a grilling so far in the panel.
I agree.
But just to pick up on one of the comments that was made about public response to nuclear weapons, and just to broaden that out, what impact are the public having on how NATO is currently positioned in Europe? And what's kind of the elite response? What sort of elite responsiveness is there to that? And second, a short and possibly incredibly ignorant question, I'm afraid, for Alexander. Could you just clarify for me, please, how 3D printing is really going to help the logistics challenges, given that raw materials presumably would have to be provided to anyone who's then going to print them?
Hi, my name is Ray Zito. I'm with General Dynamics Land Systems Canada, but also in a previous life I was also a Queen's grad from political science and UCalgary for masters in strategic studies. Yeah, thumbs up, thumbs down, thank you. This question is kind of a general one, but kind of goes with the original question that Stéfanie had about disruption, or at least this age of innovation, as I like to call it. I guess with all this new technology, with AI, with drones, with unmanned ground vehicles, and even cyber warfare, and all these put together, I guess the question is for any of the panelists, do you consider these as, say, complementary to combat capability or disruptive to deterrent capability, or are these going to become an evolution to become a whole new arena or whole new capability of deterrent capability in their own right?
Thank you. And our final question, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Brigadier General Steve Cadden. I command the 4th Canadian Division, and I've been over to Latvia 3 times in the past year. I was responsible for the training of the current battle group that's in theater now, as well as the ones that'll be deploying in the next 2 weeks for the next rotation to go through. So I've wrestled with the questions about what are the troops doing there, how effective are they a tripwire, are they not? So I'll add a quick comment on that, and I'll add a very general question as well for you. We've talked to the troops over there, and certainly they don't want to present themselves as a tripwire because nobody wants to be something that someone will just fall over to very little effect. And I harken back to my days in the late 80s when 2nd Lieutenant Cadden used to bomb around Western Germany in his 4 Leopard tanks feeling invincible. But deep in my heart, I thought that if the Fulda Gap opened and people came rolling through with, tank divisions to go through, we probably wouldn't win the war by ourselves. And we would rely on follow-on forces, the follow-on efforts coming from the alliance to actually come over and regain the ground that we had lost. So when we try to describe to the troops that are there now, they're the pointy end of the spear. And the spear comes all the way back across the country to go through. And yeah, the front part of the spear can be broken off, but the strength is in the hasp. It's in the remainder that has the thrust and pulls us forward. So I guess the question I'd ask, if you view this in the context of the Cold War, do we think that the NATO enhanced forward presence is an effective deterrent, keeping in mind all the various criteria we heard about what constitutes effective deterrence now? And is it less effective than what we had in the Cold War, when we had thousands of troops over, hundreds of thousands of troops in Europe, but didn't necessarily have the expectation that they would stop the first onslaught of heavy onslaught artillery and tanks either?
So I think that there's a real PR battle going on. There's a war of narratives. I always like to use the document which I shared with you, and I use it in my syllabus for my classes on international peace and security about, it's a NATO document produced by the Public Diplomacy Division, and it's called Setting the Record Straight. And it's all of the accusations that Russia has launched at NATO and NATO's point-by-point response to it. So I think that on the public diplomacy front and on trying to take the lead on the narrative, NATO's on that. Now, how that resonates across NATO publics, I think that varies a lot. I think if you look at the Baltic states and countries like Poland, Romania, Hungary, I think that they're a lot more responsive to those types of debates and how the narratives are shifting. When you look at countries more in Western Europe and even in Canada, I think that you would find that awareness is rather low when it comes to EFP, what it's meant to do. And in Canada particularly, I think there's something to be said, and I hope that this particular conference contributes to that, to having, raising that level of awareness in terms of our Canadian population with regards to what Canada's contribution within NATO is, what the deployment in Latvia means, what are some of those contributions there. And I think that's not just a challenge for Canada vis-a-vis this particular NATO operation, but more broadly speaking, I think that awareness generally about NATO, of what NATO is as an alliance and what it does, is fairly low. I wish we still collected systematic data on that. There used to be surveys called Transatlantic Trends where we could track domestic public's perceptions on a variety of issues, including nuclear weapons, and I miss those days, and I wish we could bring those surveys back. But generally speaking, my short answer would be it depends on the country you're looking at, and I think that there is an effort to be made in terms of increasing the level of awareness in Western Europe and Canada.
Great.
I'll comment just briefly, sir, on your question. I used to, is EFP an effective deterrent? But first, a note on your interactions with the troops and how you, getting back to General Hetherington's question about the psychology of this, I used to work with a guy, an American officer, who during the Cold War period led a nuclear artillery unit. And it was pretty clear to not just the commander, but his troops in that very small unit, when they assessed their firing range versus the blast radius, they were able to figure out pretty quickly that yeah, they were not going to last the first round. And how do you manage that? That's a good question that every leader has to assess given the individual personalities under that leader. I think in this particular case, the professionalism of the troops needs to be relied upon. And admittedly, it was a different period. It was a Cold War, but still dealing with an aggressive, adversarial country on the other side of the border. And it was the professionalism of the troops I'll come back to as something that allowed them to really hang their hat on in managing that reality. There's no easy way around it. Now, is EFP an effective deterrent? It's always difficult to measure deterrence, right? We can in part measure it by rhetoric from the adversary. We can in part measure it by actions, by the propaganda they put out in media. It seems pretty clear that it's minimally effective. Have the Russians, for example, stopped violating airspace? Have they stopped conducting no-notice large-scale exercises? The answer to those questions are no. It seems to me that we have achieved a minimally effective deterrence right now, but there's more that needs to be done, and I think that's how NATO views it right now, frankly. Not simply at the organizational level, but at the member state level. Is it less effective than during the Cold War? No, I don't think so. During the Cold War, as you experienced, we were numerically superior at that time along the border. And we're content with that inferiority in terms of the numbers, because it was not a price we were willing to pay politically, economically, culturally to match the Russians or the Soviets man for man. And so I think we can still get away with, you might say, deterrence in the same way, largely by, again, spreading risk.
Yeah, just to follow up on what John said, I actually think deterrence strategies are working in that part of the world. I think those countries are doing the best they can given the constraints that they're facing. They've made a lot of headway and raising their defense budgets and procuring the things that they need to procure to make any sort of invasion or occupation costly. Lithuania and Estonia are thinking quite hard about insurgency in ways that I think are relatively credible. There might be some problems with aspects of that strategy of theirs, but I'm generally optimistic. With regards to the clarifying question, so obviously you need to have raw resources, but the thing about various production and manufacturing processes is that component parts are made all around the world, even if the end product is made in one particular place. So you can simplify global supply chains considerably if you don't have to necessarily rely on component parts being made all around the world. That's the trick.